Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, welcome to the Lion's Roar podcast, brought to you by Lion's Roar, a nonprofit media organization offering Buddhist wisdom and mindful living to benefit our lives and create a more caring and just world. I'm Sandra Hannebohm. For more, go to lionsroar.com, and if you enjoy this episode, subscribe so you don't miss future interviews. Tibet is famous as the home of a unique and important school of Buddhism. But Buddhism was not Tibet's original religion. Today, Editor-in-Chief Melvin McLeod talks with the authors of a new book on Bön, Tibet's indigenous religion. We'll learn about the history of Bön, its influence on Tibetan Buddhism, and why its earth-centered spirituality is so important for the earth today. This episode is sponsored by St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Learn more about the St. John's Master of Arts in Eastern Classics at sjc.edu/lion.
Hi, this is Melvin McLeod, the Editor-in-Chief of Lion's Roar. I'm joined today by Harvey Rice and Jackie Cole, who are going to talk to us about their new book called Flight of the Bön Monks, War, Persecution, and the Salvation of Tibet's Oldest Religion. But even beyond the really both tragic and adventurous story that their book tells, this is an opportunity for us all to learn something more about Bön, which is not widely understood even among longtime Buddhists or even longtime practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism, and I certainly count myself among that, who don't know a great deal about Bön and don't necessarily understand its history and its influence on what we think of today as Tibetan Buddhism, but actually has many non-Buddhist influences, many of which come from Bön. So thank you very much for joining us, Harvey and Jackie. And let's start with the history of Bön, going right back at the beginning. Often it is said that Bön is Tibet's native or aboriginal religion. It's pre-Buddhist religion. Would you tell us something about its early history, its pre-Buddhist history, and its philosophy and practices? In general, maybe you could see if you could typify Bön as is it got animistic elements? Is it largely shamanistic? What do Bön, at least going back to its origins particularly, what did Bön practitioners believe and do?
According to the history of Bön, the history that the Bonpos tell, Bön was established by Buddha Trungpa Shinrab, who came from, and they say 18,000 years ago. There's been a lot of work done in archaeology in the area, and there's some question about it being, but at least 11,000 years ago is what some of the people are saying. And Trungpa Shinrab followed much the same course of life as Shakyamuni. He was a prince and then gave all that up and became a mendicant and realized enlightenment and then went about teaching how to get there. He was from the mythical area of Omolungdring, but they feel like for the most part he came from Shangshung. And Shangshung was an ancient kingdom civilization, mostly centered to the west of Tibet. And so he came from there at one time during his lifetime, came into Tibet and did some teachings, told the Tibetans to quit sacrificing animals in their rituals, and taught them some other things about Bön, and then left the seeds there to grow. There's a lot of controversy between the Buddhists and the Bonpos as to who borrowed from whom, so that the two religions now look very much alike. The iconography is similar, the rituals are similar, and so forth. But I think that, what we've been taught essentially is that you had Bön in Tibet, and then Buddhism came in the 7th century. The king of Tibet at that time was consolidating, taking in parts of Shangshung, doing political things with the countries around him, and it became politically expedient for him to switch over from Bön to Buddhism. And so he declared that Buddhism would be the court religion and the religion of the country. Bön was banned, essentially banned. And so many of the texts were, according to the Bön tradition, many of the texts were hidden in caves and became terma. And so if people understand that term, where they're discovered at a later date. And so then with that came a lot of stories and tales about how awful Bön was, which of course made it easier to ban it and to tell people that it's not a good thing to be practicing. So from there, about the 11th century, then it began to be eased up and start to be looked at again, practiced again. Many of the texts started to be appearing, and it began to look a lot like Tibetan Buddhism. With we have Sutra, Tantric, and Dzogchen, which the Nyingma tradition does Dzogchen as well, which is the oldest of the Buddhist tradition. So if you get down right to it, there is no written language prior to all of this. So it's really difficult to prove one way or another as to who borrowed from who.
So,
yes.
What, if anything, do we know about Bön beliefs and practices pre-Buddhist? Many of the words you've just used effectively sound like they parallel Buddhism. Enlightenment, realization, the fact that purportedly the founders' personal path paralleled the Buddha's. That would sound to me a bit like a later Buddhist-oriented interpretation of Bön. But what do we know about pre-Buddhist Bön? Was it indeed a more shamanistic or animistic religion, or was it indeed meditation and enlightened oriented?
The Bumpos say both, and that it was both there. But it's hard to know because there's no written language from back then. There is the traditions of rituals and healing and spontaneous, the trying to communicate with the spirits of the land. Tibet is the most amazing place. It's the harshest place you can imagine. It's giant, it's vast, everything is difficult there. And so you can well know that the people in Tibet would want to be able to connect to the land and to the spirits of the land. So there was a lot of animism or shamanism. Different people have different definitions for shamanism. So I hate to say that Bön at the time was shamanistic, but they do have carried on for all this time rituals and practices that connect with the spirits of the earth and places. The tradition that the mountains and the lakes are dyads that are female and male divine beings, and that you have protectors, and that the Nagas will be mischievous and cause trouble if you don't appease them. And so all of that has come up through there. Now, there's a lot of people who say, and I suspect that this may be partially true, I'm not a scholar of ancient Bön traditions, but there's a lot of people who say that on all those rituals that we had that was there to begin with were Bön, and that when Buddhism came in, they incorporated that. And that's the reason Tibetan Buddhism looks like it does today. Is it because it incorporated a lot of the Bön rituals and so forth that were already there?
Yes, and
I
indeed,
think
that's
the question becomes, where did the higher teachings, the meditation and the Dzogchen and all of that, when did that start? We don't have any definitive answer to that.
Yes, and of course, it's Buddhism throughout its journey across the world in various places in Asia, and in fact, even now in the United States, has indeed incorporated local customs, beliefs, and even religious practices. One thinks, for instance, of China and the incorporation of Confucian or Taoist elements
Yes.
into Buddhism there. So I think you've already spoken about ways that, for instance, what is now called Bön, or what over the centuries has become Bön, have incorporated or elements that are either from Buddhism or parallel Buddhism, such as Dzogchen, which are the highest practices of the Nyingma school. But turning that around, I'd like to, maybe you've already noted some of the elements, but to look at the elements in what we might overall now generally call Tibetan Buddhism, that are indeed not Buddhist in their origins. And I think that a lot of us who practice here in the West now what we call Tibetan Buddhism and think that it all falls under the category of actual capital B Buddhism don't necessarily understand that many of the practices and beliefs, much of the cosmology, is not necessarily originally Buddhist. And you've already noted a few, the various practices of working with local deities and protectors of various kinds, the beliefs in beings like Nagas. I would point to practices like the law song, things like that. So, what would you say are the elements that we identify now as part of Tibetan Buddhism that actually have their origins in Bön?
If you were talking to my teachers, they'd tell you all of it.
But
And if
we
you're
all,
talking to an archaeologist, they'd probably say a lot of it, but not the meditation and philosophical part of it. So you can look at the first book in Western medicine and the first book in Western English written about Bön was called The 9 Ways of Bön. And it was written by Yongdzin Tenzin Namdok Rinpoche and David Snellgrove. And this was a part of when he took them on the Rockefeller grant to London. They translated this book, or they wrote this book from translation of various things that outlines Bön. And so the 9 ways of Bön, you start with the very bottom things of making sure that your life is well so that you can study everything else. And then you go from there through the different practices. So I would say if you were looking at it and you were trying to compare, for example, the Buddhism that's practiced in China or the Zen or Vietnam and so forth, that are very different looking than the one in Tibet, that you would that we should think about the rituals, the smoke offerings, the chu. I know that there's chu in other schools of Tibetan Buddhism, the prayer flags, the anything that's more based in a connection with other deities than just the inner natural true self.
yes. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And maybe let's turn now to the more recent history aspect of this. Harvey, this might give you a chance to jump in as well. So just we're all pretty much aware that effectively the communist Chinese started to exert more and more control over Tibet, starting in the early 1950s, that culminated in 1959 in an out and out invasion, military invasion and takeover, which led to the exile or fleeing of a significant portion of the Tibetan population, primarily to India, the Sikkim, Bhutan, basically south past the Himalayas. And that also included many, many key important religious figures, the best known of whom is the Dalai Lama and other major Buddhist figures who then lamas and Rinpoches, abbots, yogis, who then went on to reestablish Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism in the Tibetan diaspora and ultimately in the West, in the modern world. Much less known, and this is the subject of your book, are the journeys of key Bön leaders in 1959 to the Tibetan diaspora, and their work to establish in the diaspora or reestablished Bön practice and community.
St. John's College in Santa Fe, New Mexico is for undergraduate and graduate students who seek a lifelong commitment to thoughtful, collaborative inquiry into fundamental human questions. Graduate students pursuing the Master of Arts in Eastern Classics examine the core literary, philosophical, and theological works of India, China, and Japan. In small, discussion-based classes, students delve into the richness of Asian traditions and study one of two languages, Classical Chinese or Sanskrit. The 3-semester Eastern Classics program offers the flexibility of both online and on-campus options. Learn more about the St. John's Master of Arts in Eastern Classics at sjc.edu/lion.
So perhaps you could synopsize that story of leaving and struggle and ultimate success in reestablishing Bön in the modern world, in the diaspora, that's told in your book.
Sure. Excuse me. So the Chinese invaded in 1950, and they began, and they promised at that time that they would honor Tibetan religion and their traditions, but they reneged on that, and rebellion started in Akkam and Amdo, which are the two far eastern Tibetan provinces. And the Chinese responded with brutal repression. And so by 1959, there were thousands of Khampas and Amdawans who were fighters who had fled the Chinese, and they were in Lhasa, and they were planning to go south of Lhasa and to form a base there to renew their struggle against the Chinese. And so, and then the Chinese invited the Dalai Lama to visit the Chinese military camp, but they said you cannot take any escorts with you. So when the populace learned that, they believed that the Dalai Lama was being set up so that he could be abducted, and that resulted in this terrible rebellion. It was thousands of people died in that, and that's when the Dalai Lama fled. And two of the characters in our book were there, and they witnessed that, and they fled as well. Tenzin Namdok, who is the main character of the book, at this time he was on the Changtong Plateau, which is a very desolate area, but there was a monastery up there, a very old monastery, and he was waiting for people from Minri Monastery, which is the primary monastery of the Bon religion. And the abbot of that monastery is the head of the Bon religion. So he waited for the abbot and his party to get there. And once they got there, there was a warlord who had connections with the CIA, which we elaborate in. We have a whole chapter on that, and they fled from there. They were ambushed. Tenzin was shot, left for dead. Actually left for dead a couple of times in that, and ended up in a prison camp. And from there, they escaped over the Himalayas with the help of these two men whose wife was in the same concentration camp as Tenzin. And in Tibet, polyandry was acceptable at that time, and so the wife was the wife of both brothers. Anyways, and so then they escaped into Nepal, and there they met David Snellgrove, who was doing research, and he was very interested in Bon, but he was one of the few people who were studying Tibet who was interested in Bon. Most people were interested in studying Buddhism. And he's the one that brought Samten Karme and Sangwe together with Tenzin Namdok and asked them to come to London. And so when they went to London, this was an event that dramatically changed their lives and the course of the religion, because they learned English there. They made connections with the Catholic community because of they were very interested in they found that the Christians had monasteries. And so they went to Christian monasteries, and they went to many monasteries. Two of Samten and Sangwe actually went and visited the Pope. And so with these connections, then they all, Tenzin went back to India. Sangwe ended up in Norway teaching at the university there in Oslo. And Tenzin was determined to start to reestablish the religion there in India. And so he found some land there, and he funded that with money from Catholic charities. So it's interesting that the Catholic religion actually helped save the Bon religion.
Wow. So what is the...
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what then is the state of Bon today? How many monasteries are there, or monastics? How many Tibetans consider themselves now active Bon practitioners? And to what extent, and I know of a few fairly prominent Bon teachers such as Tenzin Yongyal Rinpoche who have established themselves in the West. So I think that, you tell an extraordinary story, as you call it, a religion that is perhaps 8,000 years old, whose very existence was indeed threatened in the 1950s with the Chinese invasion of Tibet, that has made a successful effort to save itself and to resuscitate itself. So what kind of condition is the religion in now?
Well, it's all over the world now. You've got Bon practitioners in Poland, France, England, in South America and Brazil. And Mexico has quite a large Bon community. There are Bon communities in Houston where Jackie attends, and in many places in the United States, Boston, New York, there are quite a few places. And so it's still a small religion, maybe I don't know if the world's smallest religion, because they don't proselytize. They show up and they talk, and if people feel that they like what they're hearing, then they participate, but there's no attempt to proselytize. But even so, it's quite interesting that it's a growing religion despite that. And despite that, 95% of the people I ask, do you know what Bon is? And they say, what is that, a hot cross bun? Or, they have no idea. So
in Tibet, the religions are pretty much community oriented. So if you are from a particular area, then if you identify what area you're from, people will know which of the sects you practice. About a third of the Tibetans were Bumpos. So it's not big, but it's not minute either. And now one of the things that His Holiness, the Menri Treason, did when he started the school in India was to encourage graduates to go back to Tibet. And this, a number of them did in the 80s when China loosened the restrictions in travel to Tibet. So a number of them went back to Tibet, and we have their monasteries that are active in Tibet as much as the Chinese allows them to. And so that's allowed for there to be a stable Bun population in Tibet. There's a lot of Bun monasteries in Nepal, in little bitty tiny rural areas, Dolpo, Mustang, and so forth. Those were originally Tibetan regions, so they are now mostly Bumpo. There is the mother monastery, Menri, is in India, up in Himachal Pradesh near Solan. And then there's a second large Bun monastery in Kathmandu. And both of those produce geshes every year. Menri Monastery also has a nunnery that is graduating women geshes now as well. They've graduated their second women's class this year. So, and then of course, most everybody knows this who is familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, but the monasteries are not places to live necessarily. It's their schools. So once you graduate, unless you're going to stay in academia or administration, then you're expected to go out into the world and make your own way. So with that, we've been fortunate to have a good number of those geshes come to the West and teach us about Bun, or in the case of His Holiness requesting it, going back to Tibet to make sure that Bun is established there as well, continues to have an opportunity there.
So I think we basically ascertained that, albeit that they had early different histories, that today there is much interpenetration of Bun and Buddhism. That indeed, there's no question, as a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, I know, for instance, that many of the practices and beliefs, mythologies, to be fair, in so-called Tibetan Buddhism are actually Bun or indigenous to Tibet, not inherent in the Buddhist teachings and the Buddhist philosophy of the Four Noble Truths. And conversely, as you say, Bun has, adopted or maybe even originated in its own view, important meditational, enlightenment-oriented practices such as Dzogchen, that there are teachers of Bun Dzogchen. So I think that for us as practitioners, the interesting question is, what would be the difference? Why would we choose, or why does one choose, for instance, to study in the Bun tradition as opposed to a Tibetan Buddhist tradition? What are the differences? What would one find in a Bun situation that what one might not find in a Tibetan Buddhist situation? Or is it more that you would choose to maybe go and study in a Bun community in the same way that one would choose within Tibetan Buddhism to, say, study in a Kagyu or a Nyingma or a Gelugpa community, that you felt that its teachings or its approach was more consistent with your own personal needs? So what would be the distinct characteristics in the modern world for us as practitioners that we would find in a Bun community that might interest us and be different than we would find in a Tibetan Buddhist community?
Well, for me, I came to Bun because of the for one thing, it was available. I was living near Houston, and we had a Sangha in Houston, and so I was able to have available to me a meditation center and teachers coming through and so on and so forth. So that's one criteria: is it available to you? Now with the internet, everything's available to us. So then, as Sakyamuni would say, there's 64,000 teachings, because there's all that many different people with different, as you suggest, you pick what is a fit for you. For me, I was attracted to Bun because it's very earth-based. It has an awful lot, every single practice is connected with the elements. And so there are specific elemental practices, but there's also, even within all of it, it's all woven into the natural elements. And I'm a naturalist and a conservationist, and so this really touched me deeply personally, to be able to find a practice that is earth-based, nature-based, element-based. And so that's what I found was the difference between. I have not. Once I got into Bun, I didn't dabble in other things. So I'm aware of Zen and aware of Thich Nhat Hanh's, but I haven't delved into a lot of the Buddhists to know much more, to get to the specific differences. But I do know that one of the things is that Bun is very element based.
And that's a very good distinction. I mean, obviously there are strong elements in quote unquote Tibetan Buddhism that are earth based, but they may indeed be drawn from Bun. At the same time, much of it is around more non-material concepts like the nature of mind and such, and the nature of emptiness and such like that. So, but on the other hand, in this day and age, I think people hunger for a true earth-based spirituality that both invokes and reinforces the magic of and protects the magic of the natural world. So at the same time, one could say, as you were saying, Harvey, that this may be, if not the world's smallest religion, still a very small one. So, Jackie, my question would be, are the earth-based practices of Bun so culturally formed and dependent, and so, in effect, Tibetan, that they're not that easily accessible to non-Tibetans in the modern world? Or are there ways that this earth-based religion and these practices are indeed accessible and helpful to people in the modern world who are concerned about the health of the natural world and of their connection to it?
I think they're very accessible and they're very transferable. They element the water, earth, space, air, and what am I missing? Fire. Yep. And with each, you have practices to do that, even as much as just grounding yourself with earth, sitting with the mountains, sitting next to a body of water and envisioning and embodying yourself with the water. And each of those comes with a particular emotional thing. It connects to each organ in the body. It connects to each of the 5 poisons, so that you can use those to purify or to strengthen, depending on what you need. If you want to go into the tantric, there are deities, dakinis, goddesses, deities for each of the elements that you can invoke and transfer, and to try to practice being perfect on that embodiment for a while. So it's you can go from the very simple of just sitting on a mountain and feeling the earth, or sitting by water, to going into the very esoteric and using that to connect with the earth. And those practices are, what happens with it is that those are incorporated into the other practices as well. But when you get into it, if you can learn that, then that can become your basic practice every day. What you have to do is watch for the cycle of teaching, so that when the earth-based practices, when the 5-element practices come around, then you're available for the teachings or to seek them out. I know Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, like Mencha, Texas, has a number of online practices that include, and you can look and see if there is one of the element practices or element teachings that are there that'll teach that. There are places that have Crestone, Colorado. There's a Bun retreat center in Crestone, Colorado that is set up based on the 5 elements. They actually have prayer flags for each of the different elements set out in places around the land there, so that you can go to sit and practice that element at that particular time, at that particular location. So, so there's ways to get into it if that's what you're interested in. And I found I came to this late as an adult, and I had looked at paganism, and looked at being a tree, just trees, nothing but loving trees, and then I found this, and it just felt like coming home. So,
well, yeah, that is fantastic to hear. I want to thank you, Jackie and Harvey. I mean, I've learned a lot about this, even as a longtime Tibetan quote-unquote Buddhist practitioner. I think what you've pointed us to now, Jackie, is a basic understanding of Bun's great value, particularly in the modern world. And I also think that then when we combine that with your book, which is called Flight of the Bun Monks, War, Persecution, and the Salvation of Tibet's Oldest Religion, we see how close to destruction this ancient wisdom was, and how important it was, and how difficult it was to salvage it, and how important this kind of earth-based spirituality can be in the world today, and how helpful it can be to people. So I really want to thank you for joining us. It's been a very, very instructive and interesting conversation.
Thank you for having us.
It was great to be here.
Thanks for listening. Mission-driven, nonprofit, and community-supported, Lion's Roar offers Buddhist teachings, news, and perspectives so that the understanding and practice of Buddhism flourish in today's world, and its timeless wisdom is accessible. Go to lionsroar.com to subscribe and get unlimited access to online articles, new magazine issues, and several collections, plus perks and exclusives from Lion's Roar magazine and Buddha Dharma, the Practitioner's Guide.